Hi, my name is Luna, and I used to believe that if you worked hard, played by the rules, and loved with your whole heart, things would work out. I clung to that belief like a life raft, through long nights of study, through the chaos of single motherhood, and into the boardrooms where I thought I had finally made it. But I was wrong. Because one ordinary Thursday morning, the life I built came crashing down in a single, suffocating breath. It started with a phone call. I was sipping coffee in my downtown Chicago office, sunlight bouncing off the polished glass of the skyscrapers around me. My assistant buzzed through. Luna, there's someone from internal audit on line 2. I frowned. I hadn't done anything wrong, at least that's what I told myself. I took the call, and in the span of 5 minutes, everything I thought I knew unraveled. There were accusations, falsified reports, misallocated funds. But none of it was mine. I didn't even have access to those accounts. I asked questions. They gave no answers. By the end of the day, I was suspended. By the end of the week, I was locked out of every system. By Monday, I was fired. Just like that. 16 years. Gone. I drove home in silence that day. My hands shook the entire way. I could barely look at myself in the rear-view mirror. But that was only the beginning. When I walked into our apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Logan Square, I knew I had to put on a brave face for my daughter, Ava. She was 12. Old enough to understand pain, but still too young to carry it. She looked up at me from the couch and asked, "Mom, why are your eyes so red?" I lied. I told her the weather had irritated them, that it was just allergies. But that night, while she slept, I sat in the bathroom with the door shut and cried like I hadn't cried since my mother died. Because I knew what was coming. The mortgage was due in 2 weeks. Our health insurance would be cut off by the end of the month. And in that quiet, tiled room, I asked myself a question I never thought I would. What do you do when the system you gave everything to decides you no longer exist? I tried to fight back. I called HR. I hired a lawyer with the last of my savings. I asked for transparency, for the chance to clear my name. But the company didn't want a resolution, they wanted silence. Worse than the firing was the betrayal. I found out the person who'd submitted the reports in question wasn't some shadowy stranger, it was my former mentor, Beth Harris. She was someone I once looked up to, trusted, celebrated holidays with. She had shifted the blame onto me to save herself. And the world believed her. My LinkedIn was flooded with people wishing me the best. Some sent vague messages. Most stayed quiet. My inbox became a graveyard of unsubscribes. Doors slam and shoot before I even knocked. And just like that, I wasn't Luna the executive. I was Luna, the liability. But the cruelest moment came 2 months later. It was a rainy Friday. I got a knock on the door, 2 men in uniforms. Bank representatives. We were being evicted. I had missed 2 payments. There were no extensions left. I packed our lives into cardboard boxes while Ava cried on the porch, clutching her violin. We moved into a shelter that week. It wasn't unsafe, but it wasn't home. I shared a bunk bed with my daughter in a room with 2 other families. I learned how to lock up our toiletries. I learned how to sleep with my shoes on. The hardest part wasn't the cold meals or the fluorescent lights. It was the shame. Walking Ava to school and pretending we still lived in the same place. Smiling at teachers like everything was okay. It was the feeling of being erased, of being nobody. I'd go into libraries during the day to stay warm, scrolling through job boards, typing with numb fingers. I had degrees, experience, awards, but none of that mattered. Because no one wants to hire a woman who's been fired in disgrace. And the world doesn't make room for women like me to start over. One night, Ava asked me quietly, "Did you do something wrong?" Mom, I froze. Because I wanted to say no. But I also knew she wasn't just asking about paperwork or numbers. She was asking if the world punishes people for dreaming too big. If life is fair. If truth still matters. I looked her in the eyes and said no. Baby, I didn't do anything wrong. But sometimes, when you shine too bright, people try to put out your light. I didn't know then if it was true. But I needed her to believe that light could survive, even when everything else fell apart. If you've ever stood in a supermarket holding a gallon of milk and quietly calculating if you can still afford the bus ride home, then maybe, just maybe, you'll understand where I was. After we moved into the shelter, I tried to hold on to pieces of normal life. I made Ava's lunch every morning, brushing peanut butter onto bread like it was some holy ritual. I showed up at the school meetings, took notes like it still mattered. But inside, I was unraveling. You don't wake up one day and suddenly lose everything. No. It happens in layers. The first is shock. Then shame. Then silence. I stopped talking to people. I stopped calling old friends. I didn't want them to hear the echo in my voice. The hollowness. I didn't want to hear their well-meaning pity disguised as inspiration. You're so strong. Luna. No. I wasn't. I was tired. So tired. Some nights, I would sit on the shelter's roof when I could sneak up there and just stare at the skyline. The same buildings I used to walk into with heels and purpose now stood distant, like ghosts of a past life. I started asking myself ugly questions. Was it really Beth who destroyed me, or was it me? Did I miss a sign? Should I have stayed quiet? Was I just disposable? That's the word that haunted me most. Disposable. You give your whole life to something. And when the system spits you out, it doesn't even look back. No warning. No mercy. Just the cold sound of a door closing. I applied to everything. Every job board. Every listing. I walked into diners and hardware stores and asked if they needed help. One manager looked at me resume. Then looked at me. You used to be a director, he said. Eyebrows raised. Yes. I replied, bracing myself. You're overqualified. And that was the first time I felt like my past, my hard work, my degrees, my late nights had turned into a prison. They didn't see potential. They saw baggage. I thought about changing my name, making up a new story, starting over completely. But then there was Ava. Every night, she would curl up beside me, asking questions like, "Do you think I'll still make the orchestra next semester, or can we still have pancakes on Sunday?" She was my anchor. And also the weight on my chest, because I couldn't fail her. But I was already failing. There was one night, one I still don't like to talk about, when I stood in the shelter bathroom and holding a bottle of sleeping pills I had been prescribed months earlier for insomnia. I held them in my hand and stared at the mirror for what felt like hours. Not because I wanted to die, but because I didn't know how to keep living. Not like this. Not with this weight. This fog. This silence. I remember looking at myself and whispering, "Is this it? Is this the end of my story?" But then something happened. A stall door creaked open behind me. It was Ava. She had followed me in. "Mom," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Are you okay?" I dropped the bottle. It hit the floor with a clatter that felt like thunder. I knelt down, grabbed her hand, and held her so tightly I thought I might crush us both. That moment saved me. Not because everything got better after that. It didn't. But because I realized, if I couldn't live for myself, I had to live for her. I had to find a way not to survive, but to believe again. And so, the next morning, I did something terrifying. I walked into a public library and asked the woman at the front desk if there were any programs for people trying to rebuild their lives. She looked at me with kindness, real kindness, and handed me a flyer. Community Legal Aid Tenant Rights Workshop. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I showed up the next night, wearing a secondhand coat and carrying a notebook that still had the company logo from my old job. The room was filled with strangers, single moms, elderly tenants, recent immigrants, all of us holding silent stories of struggle. The speaker was a woman named Valerie, a community organizer. She had a fire in her eyes. She spoke about slumlords, court rights, local housing codes. And for the first time in months, I felt something flicker inside me. A spark. Not hope? No! Not yet. But something close. After the workshop, I approached her. I used to work in corporate compliance. I said quietly, I know how to read contracts. I know how to dig through paperwork. She looked me up and down and asked, "Wanna help?" And just like that, I took my first step back into the world. Not as Luna the executive. Not as Luna the victim. But as Luna the fighter. And that whisper of hope, it started to grow louder. If you had told me 6 months earlier that I'd be sitting in a church basement with a plastic name tag that read volunteer, handing out copies of tenant rights documents to women twice my age, I would have laughed. But there I was. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, I showed up still exhausted. It's still worried about the future, but for those few hours, I was useful again. Valerie, the organizer, became something of a mentor, not the kind with a corner office and a leather briefcase, but the kind with lived truth in her bones and wisdom carved from surviving. She once told me, "Luna, the world breaks people in the same way it tries to erase them. But if you stand up in that brokenness just once, you make yourself unforgettable." That stuck with me. I started small, helping families understand eviction notices, translating legalize into plain English. But soon, I was leading small groups, running role plays for court hearings, even rewriting outdated workshop materials. I still wasn't earning money, but I was regaining something I'd lost far earlier than my job, my voice. One night, after a workshop, an older woman named Diane came up to me, holding her lease with trembling hands. Her landlord had raised her rent illegally, and she was scared. I sat with her for 2 hours, digging through documents, highlighting loopholes, showing her the exact statute that protected her. The next week, she returned, smiling. I confronted him. She said, almost giddy, and he backed off. He apologized. She took my hands in hers. "You saved my home." I didn't know how to respond. Because that night, as I walked back to the shelter in the chill of early spring, I realized something. Maybe I had spent my whole life climbing the wrong ladder. Corporate success had given me titles, bonuses, status. But not this. Not the feeling of helping someone keep the very roof over their head. Still, life was far from fixed. I was juggling. Survival still broke. Still jobless. Still a mother trying to keep her daughter from seeing too much darkness. But I was moving. And one day, that momentum led me to a moment that would change everything. Valerie pulled me aside after a workshop and said, "There's a city council meeting next week. Tenant groups are presenting public comments. I think you should speak." He blinked. Me. Why? Because you've lived both lives. Luna, you know the numbers and the people. That makes you dangerous in the best way. He hesitated. I hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since before the fall. Since I was someone people listened to. What if I freeze? I asked. Valerie smiled. Then freeze. And speak anyway. So I did. The night of the meeting. I stood in line with my note cards clutched in one hand. Ava's good luck charm in my pocket, a tiny ceramic turtle she made in art class. When my name was called, I walked to the podium. The lights were blinding. The room buzzed with silence. I looked up at the rows of council members, stiff in their suits. Then I spoke. Hi, my name is Luna. I used to be a director at a Fortune 500 company. Today, I'm homeless. I heard a shift in the room. A breath held. I lost everything: my job, my reputation, my home, because someone more powerful found me easier to blame than to face the truth. I swallowed. But this story isn't just mine. It's Diane's. It's Raymond's. It's the single father sleeping in his car while working 2 jobs. It's the senior citizen with mold in her apartment and no one answering her calls. I held up a binder. This is your city. And these are your people. We don't need your sympathy. We need your courage. I finished. Silence. Then applause, slow at first. Then rising. A council member stood up and approached me afterward. Miss Tably Sebler. Luna, he said. Would you consider joining the city's Housing Equity Task Force? We need voices like yours. I was stunned. I looked at Valerie in the back of the room. She gave me a small nod. Her eyes shining. That night, I didn't return to the shelter right away. I took Ava for ice cream. Even though it meant skipping a meal later that week, she giggled the whole time. Chocolate smeared across her cheek. Mom, she said, you looked like a superhero up there. I smiled, blinking away tears. I wasn't a superhero. Not yet. But maybe I was becoming the kind of person I needed when everything first fell apart. Some moments in life knock on your door softly like a breeze. Others kick it down. After that city council meeting, the calls started. First, it was a reporter from a local radio station. Then, a small community blog. Then a journalist from a national outlet who had read a quote from my speech that was circulating on Twitter. I didn't know how my words had gotten out there. But apparently, someone had filmed me. The video had gone viral. Sure. 0 views. Then 100. Ling. Then 1 million. At first, I didn't believe it, but people started messaging me, women I hadn't heard from in years. Old colleagues. Even strangers. Some offered help. Some just said, thank you for speaking, but with light comes shadow. A week later, I got a letter. A formal one. From a law firm. They represented Beth, the woman who had destroyed my career. According to the letter, I had defamed her by alluding to my story in a public forum. They wanted a written apology. A promise to stop speaking. A gag order. I read it in silence. Then I laughed. Not out of humor, but out of sheer disbelief. Beth had taken my career, my savings, my home, and now she wanted my voice. No, not this time. I walked into Valerie's office and placed the letter on her desk. Her eyebrows rose as she read it. Then she looked up. You ready to fight? She asked. I nodded. I've been ready since the day I lost everything. We reached out to a legal aid nonprofit that partnered with our housing group. A young attorney named Michael took on the case pro bono. He read through the letter, then leaned back and said, "They're bluffing. They're trying to scare you into silence." And for a moment, I wanted to back down. Because fear has a way of creeping in no matter how far you've come. But then I remembered something Ava said one night when we were watching a documentary about wolves. "Did you know?" she said, "that when wolves are hurt, they don't cry out. They get quiet. And they keep going." I didn't want to be a wolf. But I understood what it meant to move forward. Wounded. Yes, but still walking. So I didn't sign anything. I didn't apologize. I kept speaking. And as I kept speaking, people started to listen. A university reached out and asked me to guest lecture on housing inequality and corporate ethics. I laughed at the invitation at first, me with no home of my own, but then I remembered that sometimes the ones furthest from the ivory tower carry the deepest truths. I told my story to a packed auditorium of students who took notes like my pain was a textbook. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared to believe since everything fell apart. Maybe this is who I was meant to be all along. Not a corporate star. Not someone hiding behind perfect suits and strategic reports. But a storyteller. A truth teller. A witness to injustice. Meanwhile, things slowly began to change back home. Ava won a school award for leadership in her grade. I got a part-time position coordinating community outreach for a nonprofit. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough for us to move out of the shelter and into a tiny apartment with peeling paint and a broken heater, but it was ours. The first night we slept there, Ava lay on the floor next to me in our sleeping bags and whispered, "It smells like old socks." But I love it. I laughed so hard I cried. Because after all we'd been through, love was the only thing that still smelled fresh. But life wasn't done testing me. One morning, I opened my inbox and saw an email that stopped my breath. Subject line panel invite, Women in Leadership Summit, Washington. D.C. They wanted me. Luna. The woman who once couldn't afford a sandwich to speak on a panel about rebuilding after failure. I reread the email 5 times. I wanted to scream, "You've got the wrong person," but they didn't. They knew exactly who they were asking, and so, I packed Ava's lucky turtle in my purse, bought a second-hand blazer, and boarded a bus to D.C. I sat on that stage with CEOs and best-selling authors. And when the moderator asked me about failure, I didn't flinch. I said, "Failure is not the opposite of success. It is the soil from which truth grows." I didn't lose everything. I found what actually matters. The room went silent. And in that silence, I felt something powerful, closure. Not because the pain disappeared, but because I was no longer its prisoner. After the panel, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "I watched your video online," she said. "I just left my abusive job last week. I didn't know if I'd made the right choice. Until now." I took her hand. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a woman who had been broken. I felt like a woman who had risen. The invitations didn't stop after Washington. In fact, they multiplied. Local news stations wanted interviews. Advocacy groups asked for workshops. A podcast episode where I talked about homelessness, corporate betrayal, and resilience shot to the top 10 charts in under a week. But this wasn't about fame. It was about traction. Every time I spoke, I imagined Ava in the front row. Her little legs swinging. Her eyes wide. I wanted her to see what it meant to rebuild, not into the person you used to be, but into someone stronger, clearer, more rooted in truth. A nonprofit leader named Karen reached out to me after hearing my panel in D.C. She ran a social impact incubator in Denver and offered me a spot. What would I do there, I asked. Whatever your heart demands. She replied, we help people like you turn experience into impact. So I went. Karen paired me with two mentors, Daniel, a former housing attorney turned policy advisor, and Mel, a communications expert with a background in grassroots movements. We sat in a circle on day one. And Mel asked, what's your pain trying to become? I had never heard it phrased like that. What was my pain trying to become? I thought about Diane from the community center. The single dad living in his car. The teen mom who cried during a Know Your Rights workshop. And I realized I wasn't just trying to speak out. I was trying to build something. So I said, it wants to become a bridge. They nodded. Together. We began sketching the framework of something I'd never imagined I was capable of, a platform. A real one. A nonprofit model that could scale housing literacy, legal education, and recovery coaching for those transitioning out of homelessness or workplace collapse. We called it Second Voice. Because when the first voice, your corporate title, your resume, your status gets ripped away, you have to learn how to speak again. And we wanted to help people find that second voice. Karen helped me build a pitch deck. Daniel taught me the difference between impact metrics and soul erosion. Mel taught me how to speak from my gut and still win a grant. The first pitch I gave to a group of community investors ended with polite applause and no funding. I cried in the parking lot afterward. Mel found me there, handed me a coffee, and said, you didn't fail. You introduced the world to the seed. Give it time. A few weeks later, I pitched again. This time, to a group of women entrepreneurs at a local accelerator event. When I finished, one of them stood up and said, I was where you were 5 years ago, and now I run a $10 million foundation. Let's talk. By the end of that month, Second Voice had secured its first round of seed funding, $75. Ling. It wasn't life-changing, but it was enough. Enough to rent a small office. Enough to hire a part-time program coordinator. Enough to print workbooks, host sessions, and launch the first pilot workshop in a public library downtown. And when I walked into that library room on the first day of launch, 10 metal chairs, a whiteboard, and a pile of notebooks, I couldn't stop the tears. Because I saw myself in every person sitting there. Some came with shame in their eyes. Some came angry. Some didn't say a word. But all of them were there. I started by saying, you don't have to be okay today. You just have to be here. And they stayed. Every week, the room grew. We taught skills, yes, but more than that, we created space. One woman came up to me after session 3 and said, I didn't come here for help. I came here to remember I'm still human. That night, Ava and I danced in our tiny apartment. Music blasting from a Bluetooth speaker we'd bought at a thrift store. She was twirling, laughing, alive. I was, too. But not everything was sunshine. As the nonprofit grew, so did the criticism. Trolls online accused me of fabricating my story for attention. An old coworker anonymously emailed a journalist saying I was emotionally unstable and never leadership material to begin with. I read those words in silence, and then I closed my laptop. Because I'd finally learned their narrative only held power if I handed them the pen. And I wasn't handing it over anymore. Ava and I created a ritual. Every Friday, we'd write down one thing we were proud of and tape it to the back of our apartment door. The notes piled up. You helped a mom keep custody. You spoke without crying. You paid rent on time. You said no. And one Friday, I found a note from Ava waiting for me. It said, Mommy, I'm proud of you because you didn't quit when the world got mean. I read it again and again. Because what greater legacy could there be than that? It arrived on a quiet Monday morning, one of those unremarkable days when the world feels steady and small. I was sipping my second coffee, reviewing the attendance sheet for our next second voice workshop, when I heard the mail slot click. I didn't think much of it. Bills. Flyers. Maybe a reminder for Ava's dental appointment. But when I picked up the envelope, I froze. It was thick, cream-colored. No return address. Just my name, Luna Gray, written in bold, sharp letters that looked oddly familiar. I opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, and one line into it. My breath left me. Dear Luna, I am your father. I had to sit down. My hands were shaking so badly. The paper almost slipped from my fingers. My father. The man my mother told me had died in a car accident when I was 5. The man I had no photos of. No memories of. No birthday cards. No tracce. I read on. My mind spinning. I've watched you from a distance for years. I never meant to stay away. I made mistakes. Terrible ones. But not a day has passed that I didn't think about you. I saw your video online. I recognized your eyes. I knew it was you. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. I'm living in Oregon now. I work at a vineyard. Please. Luna. You don't owe me anything. But I owe you the truth. I stared at the page for what felt like hours. Everything inside me screamed, this couldn't be real. Was it a hoax, a cruel prank? But the details were too intimate. The name of the street I grew up on. My mother's middle name. Even the nickname she used to call me when she tucked me in Little Moonbeam. Only he could have known. I sat at the kitchen table for hours. The letter in my lap. My phone silent beside me. Should I call him? Should I ignore it? What if he was lying? What if he just wanted something, or worse? What if he was telling the truth? And I'd spent 30 years building a story on top of a lie. Ava found me like that still. Pal? Paper in hand. She walked up quietly and sat across from me. Is it bad news? She asked. I didn't know how to answer. It's strange news. I finally said. Someone from my past. Someone I thought was gone. She tilted her head. Do you want to see them? I looked at her so young. Yet already carrying the weight of truths I hadn't dared speak when I was her age. I don't know. I whispered. Ava leaned in closer. Sometimes when you don't know, it means you care. That night, I couldn't sleep. Because Ava was right. I did care against my will. Against my better judgment. I cared. I thought about what meeting him might mean for me. For hair. For the identity I'd clung to my whole life. Who was I if the story I believed wasn't true? And what if he had answers to questions I never even knew to ask? 3 weeks later, I found myself on a Greyhound bus bound for Oregon. Ava beside me, reading a book about constellations. I told her this wasn't a promise. That we were just going to talk. That it might be nothing. But when we arrived at the vineyard and I saw a tall man with gray at his temples and nervous eyes pacing near the entrance, I knew. He wasn't a stranger. He was my blood. The conversation was awkward at first. He apologized over and over but didn't make excuses. He admitted to walking away. To cowardice. To addiction. To years of silence filled with guilt. But he also told stories about how he met my mother in a record shop in Portland. How he used to sing to me when I was a baby. How he'd tried to come back. But my mother had moved. How he had seen me once by accident when I was 10. On a school field trip to the zoo. He had stayed behind a tree. Just watching. Terrified to ruin my life again. I didn't know whether to cry or scream. So I just listened. That night, in a motel room smelling faintly of lemon cleaner, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My life had been shaped by absence. And now, presence was asking to be let in. Did I have room? Could I make peace with both? In the morning, Ava asked if she could write him a letter. She said she liked the way he talked to the horses, that he seemed sad in a kind way. I handed her a pencil, and I realized maybe healing didn't have to mean forgetting. Maybe it just meant understanding. We left Oregon 2 days later. He didn't ask for more than I was ready to give. Just one thing: don't shut the door just yet. Leave it cracked open. Just a little. I promised I would. And for the first time in my life, that promise didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a window. The Oregon trip had left something in me cracked wide open. It wasn't just about meeting my father. It was about the haunting realization that I had no idea how many rooms inside me I'd locked and forgotten. But now, doors were opening. Not with a bang. With a whisper. 2 weeks after we returned to Denver, I was invited to speak at a community college panel on trauma and rebuilding. I almost declined. I felt drained. Scattered. Like my soul was still somewhere between the vineyard and the motel room. But something told me to go. The auditorium wasn't large. Maybe 50 folding chairs? A few rows of eager students. Some older faces in the back. The theme was invisible wounds. And I was the third speaker after a war veteran and a domestic violence survivor. When it was my turn, I stood at the podium with a shaking hand and a voice that wasn't quite mine. I talked about housing, about shame, about silence, about identity built on absence. And then, for the first time in public, I said it. I met the father I thought was dead 3 weeks ago. He's not a ghost. He's a person. And now I have to decide what that means. There was silence. Then an exhale. A soft one. Then another. Like the whole room had been holding their breath with me. After the event, a young man approached me. Maybe 20. Maybe younger. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. My mom told me my dad died when I was a baby, he said. But I found a letter from him last month. He's alive. He wants to meet. I've been scared out of my mind. But hearing you tonight, he didn't finish. He just nodded. I nodded back. Connection. It was happening again. But this time, not just for me. That moment haunted me in the best way. I started rewriting our second voice curriculum. I added a section called Legacy Interrupted, a place to talk about fractured family stories. Or about finding truth in tangled timelines. We hosted our first group 3 weeks later. I didn't expect the response. 20 people signed up. Then 30. We had to rent an extra room. People brought boxes of old letters. Half-finished family trees. Adoption records. Faded Polaroids with no names written on the back. They weren't looking for a reunion. They were looking for peace. One woman, Janine, shared how she'd spent 40 years hating a man who turned out not to be her real father. I let that anger become my personality. She said, and now I don't know who I am without it. A man named Theo stood up and said, my daughter thinks I'm the monster her mother told her about. I came here tonight hoping someone could tell me if it's too late. I remember sitting there thinking, we are all carrying someone else's unfinished story. And maybe, just maybe, we don't have to. That was the night the idea hit me. What if Second Voice wasn't just about recovery? What if it became a place for rediscovery, for rebuilding, what was never built to begin with the next morning? I emailed Mel and Daniel with a wild proposal. I want to launch a sub-program focused entirely on reconnection. Not just with people but with parts of ourselves we've buried. Mel called it radical. Daniel called it sacred. I called it the Root Project. We designed it carefully. Workshops on generational narratives. Journaling prompts that guided people through grief they never named. Roleplay exercises where people practice conversations they might never have but needed to imagine anyway. Our pilot had 10 participants. All 10 cried within the first hour. One woman read a letter she wrote to the mother who left her at a bus stop when she was 4. A man burned a copy of a fake obituary his uncle wrote to cover up a family scandal. By the third session, the group had developed its own language, its own rhythm, and in that room, something sacred was happening. We weren't fixing broken people. We were making space for whole stories. By fall, we were running 3 Root Project groups. Word had spread. Local therapists started referring clients. A university sociology professor asked to audit a session. I stood at the back of the room one night and watched a man in his 60s finally say the words he'd been avoiding for decades. I wasn't a bad father. I was a scared one. And for the first time, he believed it. So did the room. When I got home that night, Ava was asleep on the couch, a blanket tangled around her feet, a book still open on her chest. I sat beside her and watched her breathe. So much of this, everything was for her. But somewhere along the way, it had become for me, too. And for all of us, for anyone trying to rethread the story they were told into the life they actually lived, it was a gray Thursday morning in January when the email came through. Subject line: Proposal for National Expansion, the Root Project. At first, I thought it was spam. Then I saw the sender's name: Allison McTavish, Program Director at the Belmont Foundation, a massive nonprofit that supported mental health and trauma recovery initiatives across the country. I blinked twice. I reread the email. Then I exhaled. They'd found us through a feature article in a regional wellness magazine. Someone at Belmont had read it. Then someone else? Then it got passed around their board. And now, they wanted to fund us. Not just fund us, amplify us. They were offering a multi-year grant to take the Root Project national, satellite programs in 6 major cities, paid facilitators, travel budget, publicity. It was what we dreamed of. What we whispered about during late-night brainstorming sessions. It was the kind of leap that could change lives, tens of thousands of lives. But there was a catch. Always a catch. The Belmont team had a few structural suggestions. Mainly, they wanted me to step back from active facilitation and assume the role of executive director, something more presentable, scalable, formal. They wanted me to lead, but from behind the glass. No more sitting in circles with people reading letters to their absent mothers. No more weekends driving to Oregon or Montana to help with community sessions. No more roots in the dirt. I'd be in boardrooms, Zoom calls, quarterly reports. It felt like someone had handed me the dream and quietly asked me to amputate part of my soul in exchange. I told them I needed time to think. Daniel thought I was crazy for hesitating. This is everything we've worked for. He said, "You'll still be leading, just differently." Mel was quieter. She looked at me and simply asked, "Can you do it without breaking the part of you that built it?" That question sat with me like a stone in my chest. That night, I went home, poured a glass of wine, and opened the old notebook where the Root Project was born. The first page held only a sentence: what would healing look like if it didn't have to perform? Back then, I didn't even know what I meant by that. But now I did. Healing wasn't about branding or metrics or impact statements. It was about presence. It was about the way Janine's voice trembled when she read her father's last voicemail. It was about how Theo wept when he forgave himself out loud in a room full of strangers. It was about Ava watching me be honest. Messy. human, and seeing that as strength. I thought about Ava a lot in those days. She was 16 now, smarter than me in ways that scared and humbled me. She asked hard questions over breakfast, like, why do people say yes to things that make them sick? And do you think healing is contagious? I remember one morning when she said, I hope you don't stop doing the thing that makes you glow. I smiled at her. But inside, I was unraveling. Because I didn't know if I could say yes to Belmont and still glow. A few days later, I drove back to the old rec center where we held our very first root session. The walls were still chipped. The heater still groaned. And yet, it felt like church. I sat in the empty circle. I closed my eyes, and I remembered the first time someone told their truth in this room. How the air shifted. How it felt like the whole universe paused to witness it. I didn't want to lose that, but I also didn't want to be afraid of growing. That night, I wrote back to Belmont. I said yes, but on my terms. I would accept the grant. I would help lead expansion. But I would also keep my seat in the circle. Even if it was just once a month. Even if it meant less polish. More heart. I expected them to push back. But to my surprise, they said yes. In fact, one board member wrote, "It's rare that someone can scale, impact, and stay rooted in the work. We want that. We need it." And just like that, we were in motion. 6 months later, I was on a plane to Minneapolis for our first regional launch. Then Austin. Then Detroit. Then Phoenix. Everywhere we went, people came stir it. With secrets they'd never said aloud. With wounds they'd kept hidden for decades. With hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still time to rewrite their stories. At each stop, I sat in at least one circle. I kept that promise. Because I knew the moment I stopped hearing the cracks in someone's voice when they say, "I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness," I'd lose my compass. And I couldn't afford that. Not for me. Not for them. Not for the girl who once thought being invisible was safer than being seen. Detroit was the last stop of our fall tour. The launch had been perfect. Dozens of new participants, a panel of local therapists, press coverage that made even our team tear up. I stood there, microphone in hand, answering questions from the crowd, feeling like everything I had ever fought for was finally aligning. When the applause ended, I stepped backstage to check my phone. One missed call, then another, then 5. All from Ava's school. My heart tightened. My fingers went cold. I called back immediately. It wasn't the school that answered. It was a voice I didn't recognize. A calm, heavy voice. The kind that only comes with the worst kind of news. "There's been an accident." The woman said. "Ava was taken to St. Luke's Hospital. You should come home right away." I didn't ask for details. I couldn't. I booked the first flight. My hands shook so badly I could barely enter my information. As the plane took off, I stared out the window, whispering her name over and over like a prayer. I hoped the sky would hear. "Ava. Ava. Ava. Please be okay." When I reached the hospital, Mel was already there. Her eyes said everything before her mouth could. A drunk driver. 4 p.m. Intersection. Ava was walking home from school. She didn't make it. Time collapsed. Sound disappeared. I don't remember falling. I don't remember screaming. But I know the hallway walls saw a version of me I never thought existed. For 3 days. I didn't leave my room. I didn't answer calls. Didn't respond to messages. Food was left outside the door. I couldn't touch it. The woman who built a life from brokenness suddenly had nothing but dust in her hands. I didn't know who I was without Ava. I didn't want to know. People say grief comes in waves. That's a lie. Grief doesn't come in waves. It is the ocean. And for weeks, I was drowning. The community rallied. Of course, letters poured in. Flowers. Donations. Words like light, legacy, and angel. But nothing could reach the part of me that had gone cold and quiet. The part where Ava had lived. One night, I sat on her bed. I picked up her sketchbook. She had been working on a series called Rebuild Me. Page after page of faces. Fragmented. Cracked. But beautiful. Alive. And in the margins, her messy handwriting. You can't fix a heart by pretending it didn't break. You have to listen to the cracks. I held the book to my chest and wept harder than I ever had. Something shifted that night. Not peace. Not healing. But breath. The kind that says, "You're still here." And that has to mean something. 2 weeks later, I showed up to a root session. I didn't speak. I just sat in the circle. Listening. Someone told the story of losing their brother to a heroin overdose. Another spoke of a mother lost to cancer. Another of a miscarriage. Grief was everywhere. And strangely, so was hope. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that wraps around you slowly, without asking permission. After the session, a woman approached me. I'd never seen her before. She said, "I joined Root because I heard your daughter speak about it at a youth summit last year. She told us that healing isn't about making pain disappear. It's about learning how to carry it without breaking." I couldn't breathe. My daughter's words out there echoing. Still doing what she always did, help people feel less alone. In that moment, I made a decision. We would create something new. Not just a tribute. A vessel. The Ava Initiative, a branch of the Root Project specifically for grieving youth. A space to process the unthinkable. Boken 69 stayed in ara.com/tau-nr.s. To draw. Write. Scream. Sit. To feel without being rushed toward resolution. We started small. 10 kids. Then 20. Then, entire schools began asking to implement it. We hired therapists, artists, musicians. We didn't ask the kids to explain their pain. We just gave them the mic. And they used it. One boy brought in his father's dog tags and read a poem that made the entire room sob. A girl painted a mural of her sister's bedroom from memory, every object a symbol. Every color, a feeling. They were rebuilding. And through them, so was I. Grief never left. It doesn't. But I learned something. Love doesn't die with the person. It becomes something else. A force. A mission. A promise. Ava didn't just leave a void. She left a direction. And I was still walking in it. With every child who spoke her words without knowing it, with every drawing that held the ache she once carried, with every circle that dared to sit in silence with the unbearable and stay, I wasn't the same Luna after Ava. But maybe that was the point. Some stories aren't meant to go back to how they were. They're meant to become something entirely new. There's a trail behind my house in Vermont, tucked between a row of birch trees and a mossy ridge that catches morning sunlight like a secret. I walk it almost every day now. No headphones. No phone. Just breath. Birds. And the soft hush of wind in the branches. This isn't the Luna people remember from conferences or interviews. This is the woman who finally learned how to sit with silence and not mistake it for absence. 2 years have passed since Ava's death. 2 years since everything that once gave me direction shattered like glass. And somehow, here I am. Still walking. Still showing up. But with different footsteps now. Slower. Softer. More grounded in grief. But also in grace. People often ask, "How did you come back from that?" I don't think I came back. I think I moved forward as someone else. A version of me that was forged in fire and rebuilt with trembling hands. A version that doesn't need spotlight or applause. Just truth. Stillness. Connection. The Root Project continues to grow. We now have programs in 12 cities. Thousands of people have passed through our circles. The AVA initiative has become one of our most requested modules. Teenagers write letters to grief. They choreograph dances to sorrow. They laugh in the middle of crying and say things like, "This is the first time I've felt seen in months. It's beautiful. It's holy. But I no longer need to lead every piece of it." That was one of the hardest things I had to learn, that stepping back is not the same as giving up. There is power in trusting others to carry what you once held alone. Now, I train facilitators. I mentor quietly. I write more. Speak less. And I spend time in the woods. Time with myself. Time with the absence. That is also presence. Sometimes I visit Ava's favorite coffee shop in Burlington. They kept her seat open for months after she died. Eventually, they replaced the chair but kept a small plaque near the window. She made people feel brave enough to speak. I sit there sometimes. Watch students rush in with their laptops and too much caffeine. I imagine Ava among them. Hoodie pulled over her head. Sketchbook open. Big dreams dancing behind her tired eyes. She'd be 20 now. I like to think she'd be proud of who I've become. Not because I did something big, but because I kept going. Because I learned how to carry her with me. Without being crushed by the weight. That's something they don't tell you about grief. You don't get over it. You learn how to let it walk beside you. You learn that healing isn't a staircase, it's a spiral. Some days you feel strong. Other days you dissolve into tears in a grocery store aisle because you saw a cereal box she loved. And both days count. Both days are sacred. Not long ago, I received a letter from a young woman in Chicago. She had attended a root circle during a campus retreat. In her letter, she wrote, "I don't know what kind of magic you put into this program. But for the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt in progress. Like maybe I'm not ruined. Just becoming." I cried when I read that. Not out of sadness, but because she put into words what I couldn't for so long. We're all in progress. Not finished. Not failed. Becoming. That's the word I carry now. Not healed. Not strong. Just becoming, every day, a little more honest, a little more soft, a little more alive. There's a journal I keep now, leather-bound, frayed at the edges. Inside, I write letters to the woman I used to be. Sometimes I thank her. Sometimes I forgive her. Sometimes I remind her, you didn't fail. You evolved. And one day, when I'm older, I hope to hand that journal to someone else. Maybe a girl who's just lost her way. Maybe a mother learning how to grieve. Maybe a man who thinks tears make him weak. I'll place it in their hands and say, "Here, these are the footprints I left behind. Follow them if you want. Or make your own. But whatever you do, don't stop walking. Because even in the darkest forest, even when the map is gone, even when your heart has forgotten how to hope, there is still a trail. Still light between the trees. Still something inside you whispering, one more step. And that's where I am now. Not at the finish line. Just on the trail. With muddy shoes, an open heart, and the name Ava tucked inside every breath.